Hello, and welcome to another Sheldrake-Vernon Dialogue with myself, Mark Vernon, and Rupert Sheldrake. Hi, Rupert.
Hello, Mark.
These are conversations that we have. We just get together, as we just have now, and think of something which we've been thinking about ourselves separately, and then offer it to each other in a way, see what comes out of our exchange, very much in the hope that it prompts thoughts and maybe even actual conversations amongst you and your circle of friends and people that you talk about these kind of things with. So I hope that this is a good subject. And Rupert, I have been thinking a lot recently about a new approach to the evolutionary origins of religion. This particular approach is being put together by Robin Dunbar, the very well-known evolutionary psychologist at Oxford University. And I confess at first I was a bit sceptical because these evolutionary origins of religion that particularly have come out of the cognitive sciences in recent years, I find them just too reductive. So perhaps the best known is sometimes called like the big God idea, which is that our evolutionary ancestors, so the early Homo sapiens, probably not the case in Neanderthals, people think, but nonetheless you can debate that. But certainly early modern humans, they needed a big God to tell them off when they were doing things wrong in order that society could be held together. You know, they sort of put the fear of God in people in order that the tensions that inevitably rise in large groups of people dissolve. And the idea, broadly speaking, is that our more distant evolutionary cousins, the apes and monkeys, they do it by grooming, and that grooming releases endorphins, these kind of opiates that calm tension. But that has a kind of limit because you need to do the grooming and there's only so much time in the day. So it puts a natural limit on the size of the groups that monkeys and apes can form before the tensions destroy them and they split apart. So human beings, as it were, to develop into the largest, much larger sizes now, but even the larger sizes, say, 200,000 years ago, needed a new way of virtually grooming, if you like, and that big gods was one way of doing it, in this kind of negative way, that it put you feared punishment from without if you messed with your neighbour, too intently and caused tension in the group. So that's one. The big gods approach is one, and I've always thought it a bit reductive. And so when I heard about this new one, I'd assumed that it was going to be similarly reductive. And broadly, the idea again is that instead of a big god functioning as the kind of virtual way of keeping people together, that it was trance experiences that did this. And the idea is that around about, in the Middle Paleolithic, so around about 200,000 years ago, our ancestors discovered that they could deliberately induce altered states of consciousness. And that this frenzy, this effervescence, to use Durkheim's terms, because it has got a backstory, this kind of idea of religion, but this is giving it a new twist. This effervescence produces the endorphins, does the kind of work of the virtual grooming, as well. Everyone gets a bit high, you might say, and that eases tensions. But it turns out that there's a whole lot more going on in the theory. And I really like it because it actually takes transcendence seriously. It's not just the kind of instrumental understanding of religiosity. Now, there's a whole lot more that I could say about that, but maybe I should just sort of let you chip in for now, these things that you've considered as well, these evolutionary understandings of religion, sort of our deep human evolution.
Yes, well, like you, I'm very sceptical of the sort of big God idea, partly because shamanic hunter-gatherer societies, as far as I know, don't often have big gods. They have ancestors, they have spirits of various kinds, animal spirits, but big gods, like sort of monotheistic type gods, as far as I know, not part of it anyway. So,
I mean, that's absolutely a person who's working on this new theory as part of the group. He's researched that precisely and says that big gods are very exceptional. They have arisen late in human evolution, far after settlements and so on.
Yes.
And that it seems that maybe it's only Western monotheism is really the only example, and that other religions that have a kind of big God have learnt that from this one exception of monotheism. So as a universal theory of religion, it completely failed, in fact.
Yes, well, exactly. I would have thought just on its own terms it's not valid. And also, I think taking religion to be primarily about keeping people in order, again, it's got a kind of very 19th century feel to it, that theory. So, that it's all about morality and manipulation and stuff. I think the trance theory is much, much more plausible. I mean, altered states of consciousness, I think, are the origin of religion everywhere. It seems to me almost obvious that must be the case. And even if we look at the stories of the well-known religions in the world, in the Hindu rishis writing the Upanishads, or through whom those great insights came, were doing it by meditating in caves in the Himalayas. It was about experience. The Buddha became enlightened sitting under a Bodhi tree, not by studying books or trying to impose morality on people. And Jesus became aware of his connection, his intimate, deep connection with God through the rite of passage of his baptism when he became illuminated by the Holy Spirit. So all of these are stories of altered states of consciousness at the beginning of religions. Muhammad dictating the Quran is something that he heard. It was channeled in an altered state of consciousness. So even if we look at the narratives of religions themselves, it's clear that they start from altered states of consciousness. And the evolutionary material I've been looking at has persuaded me that singing and chanting was a major part of this. It's found in all cultures, and many people think that singing and chanting preceded language, and that singing together and dancing together can have trance-inducing functions today. I mean, there's still, trance dances and ecstatic dancing. I mean, raves are based on this principle. But in traditional societies, when people discovered how they could sing together, they literally came into resonance with each other, as people still do, singing together today. And by moving rhythmically together, it literally entrains the whole group. So I would have thought that was one of the most obvious ways of bonding societies together, more so than grooming, which has to be one-on-one. This is where the whole group can participate through singing together. And this is something that's still part of all religious traditions. Yeah,
actually, again, in this group looking at this whole idea again, they've actually even tried to measure the effects of even relatively modest religious rituals, like Church of England. They went to Church of England services where you basically just stand to sing and then kneel to pray, and then maybe go forward to the altar at one moment in the service. So, relatively minimal collective action, but that has a measurable effect. That does release endorphins, and you can detect that. So which suggests that it's actually a very powerful effect.
Yes.
Anything approaching what you might call ecstasy is going to have a very powerful effect indeed, including singing and chanting.
Exactly. And you see other altered states of consciousness, which I discuss in my book, Science and Spiritual Practices, and Ways to Go Beyond and Why They Work. I mean, these spiritual practices that are still used today have ancient origins in many cases. Another one is fasting. And in many shamanic cultures, people fast before rites of passage or before vision quests or before significant religious events. And fasting, of course, is still practiced is part of all religious traditions. And fasting induces altered states of consciousness. I mean, the ketone bodies in the blood, beta-hydroxybutyric acid in particular, are very similar to neurotransmitters, gamma-aminobutyric acid and gamma-hydroxybutyric acid. And they change the levels of these neurotransmitters in the brain, the ketone bodies in the blood during fasting. So fasting is psychoactive. And in traditional hunter-gatherer societies, there would always have been periods in the year when there wasn't enough food. So people would have been under conditions of enforced fasting or starvation quite often, and that gives altered states of conscioussness. And then, of course, there's my friend Terence McKenna's famous stoned ape hypothesis, that when shamanic people discovered things like magic mushrooms, that these altered states of consciousness were hugely important in showing them other realms of being. And then, of course, the actual archaeological evidence, some of the earliest evidence is from those cave paintings and ritual objects in caves dating back 35 to 40,000 years. Not quite as long a time frame as you're talking about, but it's clear that the people who were painting those pictures and handprints and things on cave walls were doing it as part of a ceremony, and it obviously involved altered states of consciousness that are these animal-human figures of the kind you might see in a psychedelic vision or a dream or a trance. They're certainly not straightforwardly naturalistic. They were perfectly capable of doing naturalistic drawing and painting as well, and some of them are very beautiful. But those are often deep inside caves, often in resonant parts of caves, and suggest that people were meeting there for ceremonies in which they were singing, chanting, and drumming. Rhythmic drumming was probably part of a lot of these altered states of consciousness, and it still is today. I mean, Michael Harner, who used to give weekend workshops on shamanism, he sort of popularized shamanism, had this rhythmic drumming technique for inducing trance in workshop participants in places like Essel in California. So, these things work today, and they certainly had those technologies then. So I think it's almost beyond question that this is a major part of it.
Yeah, and the thing that I got excited about was that you can actually put together evidence that really shows it was perhaps happening not just 30 or 40,000 years ago like the cave art, but was happening 200,000 or 300,000 years ago, and like another sort of leap back. So, for example, one of it is to do with brain size, and that anatomically modern humans had the brain size that suggests they had the degrees of intentionality to be able to conceptualize what they experienced in the trance states. And this turns out to be really important, and I found it really fascinating. So the idea is that many animals have lower degrees of intentionality, so which that basically means that they're aware of their own sense of things, and they're aware that another species member will have a sense of things. So like chimps, it's thought have 2 or 3 degrees, so they can, as it were, think, I'm thinking this, my brother chimp is thinking that, and together we can work it out. But that's pretty low. What you need to conceptualize altered states and not just have undifferentiated, say, experiences of wonder and awe, which again, there's good evidence that chimps do. There's good evidence that, for example, they'll gaze at a sunset and be a sort of, seem to be deriving pleasure from it. But that's different from really developing it into something that could be called a proto-religion, because you need to start to be able to conceive that there's me and my brother together sharing an experience with the tribe that relates to the god or the gods, the ancestors that are around us too. So to do that, you need 4 or 5 degrees of intentionality. Think of yourself, another, the tribe as a collective, the ancestors as another party in this, and then some sort of sense of history, that this is part of our tradition as well. And you can relate that to brain size, it turns out. So you can sort of get archaeological evidence together that it's circumstantial, it's very highly debated, and so on. But nonetheless, it provides some robust sense that what shamans do now was in fact happening back then too. Another really fascinating area that I've been reading about is to do with hand axes. And what's so interesting is that very functional hand axes were made by our ancestors like Homo erectus. So they would chip bits of flint, and they did this for over 1 million years, making these hand axes, which is quite extraordinary in itself. But they were more or less completely driven by function. But then what starts to happen is that you get hand axes which have a bit of design, or they carry a kind of beauty that exceeds the function. and eventually you get very, very beautifully produced hand axes. And when you start to think about what that entails, again, you start to realise that people must have had a sense that there's beauty in the world, that they could experience and appreciate in a committed way that would draw themselves towards it for perhaps many, many centuries, whilst the technology of hand axe making grew enough that a hand axe could start to symbolise that beauty that they perceived in the world around them. And so what's really fascinated me about this is that often the story of, say, the development of hand axes is told in a purely sort of functional way, as if our ancestors needed means of transacting value, so they developed beads, they developed hand axes, and so on, that we then find in grave goods. But it's purely done at a sort of transactional level. But when you think about what it takes to produce these objects, which perhaps take many, many generations to actually emerge, there must have been a fascination, I think, with the transcendent aspects of life to do that. And so the suggestion is that these were byproducts, in fact, of an intentional exploration of what altered states started to show people, and that it was a part of a kind of spiritual exploration, if you like, that was driving human evolution. So what really excited me to kind of go back to where we started with the reductive takes on the evolutionary origins of religion, I started to realise that this new approach is actually saying, no, it's like a spiritually or transcendent driven story of human evolution that actually inverts the normal story. Spirituality is not the byproduct. Spiritual questing and so on, it's quite plausible, I think, was actually in the driving seat. And this is sort of coming out from the science. This isn't just people that like shamanism now. There's something quite compelling that I think is beginning to emerge, that suggests we were always, if you like, Homo spiritualis or something like that. Yes. And that's where our sapiens, where our wisdom, that's where our technology comes from. I'm wondering whether, in a way, the dumping of the old, very, very, as you say, kind of 19th century feel stories is made the space of something that actually could develop in really fascinating ways, in very expansive ways.
Yes, I agree. I think actually the sense of beauty thing is very deep. I think that flowers, been around for about 100 million years, long before humans, and have evolved in the context of insect eyes primarily. Bees, butterflies. As Darwin said, before there was an eye to see it, there could have been no flower. And so flowers are some of the things that we find most beautiful, but it's not just us. They've evolved in connection with animal minds, in this case insect minds, which are they have very simple brains. I mean, ganglia, they're hardly a brain at all. And yet, all that beauty, orchid flowers, sunflowers, all these daisies, foxgloves, all these wonderful flowers that we have evolved in response to a sense of beauty in animals. So it would be very surprising if humans were exceptional and didn't have it. And then the same goes for sexual selection, as Darwin pointed out. Butterflies, all those beautiful butterfly wings, they're beautiful because they're part of, according to Darwin, this is part of the attractiveness. It's driven by sexual attractiveness. But beauty is not explained by sexual attraction alone. The fact that insects, butterflies, find other butterflies beautiful means there's a sense of beauty deep in animal nature. And the same goes for birds and their feathers. And actually, I think that when we look at hand axes in human societies, these are obviously things that last, and archaeology is heavily biased in favour of objects that, like rocks and stones, hand axes that last. But if at the same time, in that million years when they weren't developing much more elaborate hand axes, it could well be that humans were adorning themselves with flowers and with feathers, as many people still do today. I mean, there are many parts of the world where women wear flowers in their hair, or there's feathered headdresses, and hats that people go to Royal Ascot in have feathers on them still. I mean, this adornment with flowers and feathers would not leave much in the way of archaeological traces. and could have been very deep in human nature. I mean, it's there today. It's through, the entire fashion industry and the jewellery industry. And that goes back a very long way. And, it may be that by the time people started making beads and ornaments, which I think is not until about 30,000 years ago or something like that, that these are ceramic beads that last. Before that, they could well have been having floral garlands and so on.
Yeah, your comment, that beautiful comment of Darwin's about there will be no flowers without a mind to appreciate them.
Or an eye to see them.
An eye to see them,
yes.
an eye to see them. I mean, it reminds me of in The Descent of Man, where Darwin is talking about observing, I think it's Argus pheasants, and he watches the female pheasants looking at the male displays. And he says I know some people won't like this, but it's hard not to think that the female pheasant isn't looking at the subtleties of the display with a kind of connoisseur's eye or something like
yes.
that. So although it's in his discussion of sexual selection, I think even in that, he's quite aware that beauty has its own kind of logic, its own sophistication.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
No, he's absolutely right. He's quite explicit about it. He says, they must have a sense of beauty, the female pheasants. But then he says, but what is the sense of beauty? And he just leaves that as an open question, doesn't answer it.
So do you think this is, in terms of the way that evolution has got into popular culture now, do you think this could all be part of a kind of corrective that's taking us away from a very reductive account of Darwinian evolution, which has basically said that the butterfly's wings are just an expression of genetic fitness or something like that?
Yes. Oh, I think so. I mean, actually, even within hardcore biology, evolutionary theory is in ferment at the moment. The extended evolutionary synthesis is going way beyond narrow gene-based neo-Darwinism to include epigenetic inheritance, the inheritance of acquired characters, things that can be learned, or adaptations of animals and plants we now know can be passed on to their ancestors in many cases epigenetically rather than genetically. And this extended evolutionary synthesis also gives a bigger role to cultural transmission and learning, and many animals have cultural transmission. Migratory routes, for example, in starlings depend on a cultural transmission. Young starlings learn by migrating with older ones, and if they don't have the older ones, they go in a different direction. It's not true of all species. Young cuckoos can migrate without older ones, and then it's purely instinctive. But the extended evolutionary synthesis is, I think, opening up a much broader, as the name implies, a much more inclusive and broader way of thinking of evolution from this narrow, rather shrill, dogmatic, reductionist neo-Darwinism that we've had for so long. So I think these looking again at the evolutionary origins of religion fits into this much richer picture of evolution that we're getting.
Yeah. There's another thing which I liked from the this new theory as well, which includes not just biologists and archaeologists, but also sociologists and theologians too. They're really trying to build in that kind of extended richness into the project. But is how it also looks at how religion has evolved and sort of set up a tension within religion, which I find quite fascinating, which is that when human beings really started to settle in towns and villages, so this is in the so-called Neolithic revolution, so after the Paleolithic period, so maybe about 10,000 years ago, when settlements started to form, you get the building of temples, and you get the development of what you might call religious specialists, so like priests, who are a bit different from the shaman in the hunter-gatherer group. They, as it were, they're sort of employed, you might say, by the town to keep the religious practices alive. And what this theory also suggests is that this sets up a kind of tension between the more settled quest for transcendence, which maybe you got by taking part in the feast or entering the temple, or at certain times of year, with the much more immersive, trance-like experience of religiosity, which you got through the sort of the very powerful rite of passage, or through the chanting and the dancing which was very much more rooted in a natural place rather than a constructed place. And so this is one of the things which they're wondering about, is why there does seem to be in the history of religion this kind of tension between institutional forms of religiosity and mystical, awakening, charismatic kind of uprisings, which suggests that the institutional form has lost touch a bit with its wellspring. And I quite like that idea, because I sort of feel myself to be somewhere situated between this kind of tension between institutional forms of Christianity and the kind of wellspring, which I've tried to write about in my book, A Secret History of Christianity, which in a way is an attempt to try to help people refine the mystical core that I think can get a bit out of focus within Christianity. But it also made sense to me in sense of culturally, the interest in trance, in shamans, in psychedelics, in pilgrimage, even, these, I think, no less powerful, if less kind of florid kinds of ecstasy as well. And that in a way we're culturally doing what our ancestors did, which is trying to find ways of just inducing altered states to reconnect with, different realities which are around us, but modern materialism can occlude from us.
Yes, I think that's certainly true. I mean, in the Middle Ages in Europe, there was in fact a coexistence of religion in sort of church services and cathedrals and so on, with also lots of hermits and all sorts of monastic orders. Some of them very contemplative, some of them very active, some of them like the Franciscan friars, explicitly connecting with nature. And then, as we discussed in Celtic Christianity, there were these shamanic type practices, standing in cold water and so on. Those all coexisted. So I don't see it as either or, of course. I mean, in my own life, I find going to services in cathedrals and churches really helpful. But I only do that for a total of, 2 hours a week or something. And, the rest of the time outside in nature, I meditate, I pray, I sing, I take part in a whole range of other spiritual practices, which I find all these things go together. I don't see it as either or. And the coexistence of all these layers is actually clearest of all in India, where, there are great temples, there are the Brahminical rituals in Sanskrit with trained temple priests. They have all that. They have pilgrimages, of course. They also, in most Indian villages, have sacred trees and sacred termite mounds and sacred cobra nests and sacred monkeys and rats and elephants. And, there are all these animals and holy trees and plants and sort of shamanic type practices going on as well. And then there are various wandering sadhus, holy men, and people meditating in caves and going on lifelong. Well, I mean, sadhus many of them keep on the move on a permanent kind of pilgrimage, and visiting springs, the source of the Ganges, sacred caves. And all of this goes on in India, together with, meditation, yoga, and all sorts of spiritual practices. So it's remarkable how all these levels and stages coexist still.
Yeah, I mean, I part of what I feel we need to recover in the West, and I've got this from Owen Barfield, I've mentioned several times in our conversations, who's kind of the guide for my book. He's very clear that we need to forge, actually, to deliberately cultivate a new kind of participation with the natural world, not just with the divine, to remake this kind of rich spiritual ecology, which you can find still very much alive and kicking in places like India. That part of what's happened to religiosity in the West is it's got a bit rarefied. If you do believe in God, it's probably like God, perhaps one other figure like Jesus, and then kind of you and your group. But the natural world, since the Reformation, say, has got a bit become rather disenchanted. But I think that this sense of how religion has always been connecting to a kind of enchanted cosmos, rather than, say, the moral demands of religion, which can sort of steal the show a bit. I'm hoping that this story, partly because of where it's coming from, because it is coming out of a kind of science, it gives people permission, which is something which we talk about quite a lot, give people permission to re-enter this enchantment, to rediscover the spiritual ecology that's round and about, and as you say, make it part and parcel of everyday life, and not just something that happens, occasionally on a Sunday.
Absolutely.
Well, look,
couldn't agree more.
Well, maybe that's a good point to finish then. If anyone listening did want to read about it, apart from looking up the work of figures like Robin Dunbar, I've done an extended essay actually on the website Aeon, which is AEON, that do long form essays, and it should be out pretty soon. We're speaking in the early part of October, but it should be out pretty soon to try and really lay out not just the evidence but the implications of all this. But anyway, thanks very much, Rupert. Nice to speak to you.
Good, thank you, Mark.